You want the straight skinny? You want the real story? History in the Highway was made for you. True stories about real people and American tales right off the road. Sometimes from the blacktop, sometimes from the roadhouse, but always just as straight and true as chrome and steel. Throttle up, baby. This is History in the Highway. From 1884 to 1896, Grover Cleveland dominated the American political landscape. At that time, the elections were bitter and acrimonious, yet sometimes they were more polite and proper than people had seen in years. But Grover Cleveland always stayed above the politics. His honesty and personal integrity set a high standard in an age of government graft, and Cleveland would make a bushel of enemies. It was an age of railroads, banks, and big business versus the common man, special interest and self-interest versus we the people. And Grover Cleveland would always stand tall for what was right. Caldwell, New Jersey. It's right here that Stephen Grover Cleveland was born on March 18, 1837. He was the son of a minister. His father was actually an itinerant preacher that cared for several flocks. And it was his daddy that influenced Cleveland's point of view on right and wrong for all of his life. His father would move the family to upstate New York and then pass away while Cleveland was still a young man. Grover didn't have a chance to go to college. He had to set to work and make sure things were right for his family. He started work as a clerk in a law firm. As soon as he learned enough law, he passed the New York State Bar, went to work as an attorney, until he was elected the sheriff of Erie County, New York. Now, as sheriff, Cleveland would hang 3 men for crimes they'd committed. And to date, he's still the only president who ever served as an executioner. Not long after, he was elected the mayor of Buffalo, New York. Seems during his tenure as mayor, there was a street cleaning contract that came up for bid. Fellows on the city council wanted to award that contract to the highest bidder. That didn't seem right to Mayor Cleveland, and he awarded the contract to the lowest bidder. That would set a standard that would endure throughout Grover Cleveland's political life. For Grover, there wasn't a whole lot of gray in the world. It was pretty much black and white. And Grover Cleveland always stood for what he felt was right.
Grover Cleveland himself said that being raised as a minister's son had the most impact on him compared to anything in his life. Right was right and wrong was wrong. There wasn't a lot of wiggle room.
There you have it.
Yeah.
Grover Cleveland would be elected the governor of the state of New York. He'd shown a lot of mettle as the mayor of Buffalo, but nobody yet knew the real degree of strength, courage, and independence that this man had. He was a Democrat, but he managed to impress a number of Republicans, among them future President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. And TR was not a man who was easily impressed. Now, when the police force in the city of New York went on strike, Governor Cleveland sent in the state militia, that's a precursor of the National Guard, to quell the mob violence that erupted while the police were on strike. He forced the officers to get back on the job, and the guys that wouldn't return, he never hired again. He said to the union organizer Samuel Gompers, "No one has a right to strike against the public safety." It's a line in the sand our government has stood behind ever since. And it's what put Grover Cleveland on the map nationally and made him respected as a reformer and an independent thinker. Grover Cleveland would come to the presidency with the help of the mugwumps. Now, a mugwump is an imaginary animal. It has its mug on one side of the fence and its big old wump on the other. In this case, the mugwumps were Republicans who decided not to support their own boy, Mr. Blaine, but to support the Democratic candidate, Mr. Cleveland. The mugwumps loved his reform ideas, his desire to continue to purge government of corruption. And in fact, Grover Cleveland would follow the same path as his predecessors, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur. He would continue to purge government. Now, about this same time, the Statue of Liberty would be dedicated and completed. And it was President Grover Cleveland that gave the dedicatory address, opening the Statue of Liberty to the American nation. It was the great gift between the two free republics, the Republic of France and the United States of America. Now, in his personal life, Grover Cleveland would marry the much younger Frances Folsom. She was 27 years his junior. Now, at that time, this was a scandal, but the bride and groom really couldn't be bothered. They went right out and started a family, just like regular American folks would do. Now, in the election of 1888, the mugwumps changed sides. They were going to support Benjamin Harrison because he was going to protect American industry with high tariffs. Grover Cleveland was out of a job. He'd return to New York City, take work with a law firm, and patiently wait 4 years for the election of 1892. Now, on her way out the door, Frances Cleveland famously said to the White House staff, "Don't be moving the furniture. We'll be back in 4 years." And you know what? She was right. The policies of Benjamin Harrison were largely unpopular. In fact, the entire presidency of Benjamin Harrison had left a very sour taste in the mouth of the American public, and the election of '92 was not going to be easy. Now, an interesting thing about that election, Mrs. Harrison was dying of tuberculosis, so President Harrison opted not to publicly campaign. Out of respect for Mrs. Harrison, Grover Cleveland chose to not publicly campaign either. The American people loved him for it, and Grover Cleveland swept back into office in a landslide. Cleveland remains the only American president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms.
Subscribe now. It's history with attitude and the American story with an edge.